that's really more of a fourth rounder in my opinion, but still it helps ease that burden. Now you can bring, like you said, what N'Keal was supposed to be, the outside contested catch guy. He's more of a possession receiver. And honestly, that's the kind of, receiver that Bills really had a hard time drafting. I know that this has been his big thing the last, day or so with Mike Florio on Pro Football Talk posting about the Patriots, need to look themselves in the mirror and realize they can't draft wide receivers. Well, I'm here to tell you that, yes, they have struggled at times drafting wide receivers. I also don't think they've put in a ton of high ammo, in terms of draft capital. They've had a little bit of bad luck here and there, but honestly, yeah, I would say, if I'm being honest, it's not their strongest position, but there are others that they've drafted and developed really well. And they've had some luck bringing in veteran players. We know at the end of Tom Brady's tenure here, that was a real thing where it was like, okay, if you're going to bring in a new receiver, how is he going to work out with Brady? I think that Brady's mental capacity for the offense really threw a wrench into acquiring new guys. Now with Mac Jones only in his second year, I don't think that's as big of an issue. What are your thoughts on that, Steve?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think you hit the nail on the head. If you look at what the Patriots invested in wide receivers, I mean, generally it was fourth round and below, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh rounders. Sure. They weren't wasting a lot of capital on, first, second rounders at the wide receiver position. And, they never drafted one. Well, that's not true. I mean, Deion Branch, David Givens, those guys were hits early in Bill's career. Julian Edelman, for some reason, everyone doesn't want to include Julian Edelman in that conversation. And the thing we always hear is, well, nobody knew what Edelman was going to be. Well, there you go. But, the Patriots saw something in him.
Well, and they developed. Back to what I said a second ago, I would say that, if people want to poo-poo Edelman because they didn't draft him as a receiver, they didn't know what he was going to be, I would still give Bill credit for identifying a player that, was about to go undrafted. They ended up taking him, and they put him in a role that they thought his skill set would translate to, and he exceeded. And there's been a lot of undrafted guys at multiple positions that Bill has identified late round players and had success.
He saw it in the very first training camp. That was the moment where Wes Welker wasn't dressed, and he said, "Hey, you know who Wally Pipp is?" So Bill saw that right off the bat with Edelman, and so he does deserve credit for that. Also, I think, like you said, they had some bad luck. I think Malcolm Mitchell would have been I don't think he would have been a superstar, but he would have been a very, very good NFL player.
Yeah, Malcolm Mitchell I'm torn on, right? Because the reason he was available where they drafted him was because of the medical red flags. And I think the Patriots, they obviously did their own physical checks and all that, the combine and everything before that. But to me, it's like you get kind of a hit because he did produce in a really big game for you. And when he was able to be on the field, he was able to, be the player they wanted him to be and projected him to be. But the red flag of the medicals kind of snuck back up there. But I still give him a hit for that one. And again, we're talking about middle round players. If you're going to tell me the Patriots haven't drafted well, and then you're going to mention Josh Boyce from TCU a decade ago, I'll tell you to just GTFO. I mean, let's be honest. But let me ask you about this, Steve. Let's bring it back from the draft to right now, this coming season. You look at the receiver depth chart. Obviously, you have Kendrick Bourne, Jacoby Myers, Nelson Aguilar, DeVante Parker, just kind of those top four guys. Do you think this move threatens anyone in that four, or do you look at it as maybe threatening N'Keal Harry? Because I think your first reaction, a lot of people was, well, N'Keal's gone. I think there was a good chance N'Keal was going to be gone anyway, but we'll circle back to that point. But for this now, do you think that they could be looking to move on from Nelson Aguilar potentially, or do you think they ride him out for the last year on his contract?
Yeah, I don't think they're going to move him because, if you move him, I mean, you already, like you said, they're probably going to move on from N'Keal Harry anyway.
Right.
And then it becomes a depth issue again. Now you're dealing with a depth issue. Now you have four NFL quality wide receivers. Not saying they're great wide receivers, but they're NFL quality wide receivers. And I think that is one of the missing pieces of this offense. He brings that element of speed to the outside. He's a big guy. He can stretch the field horizontally and vertically.
Sure.
He makes those contested catches. I think that he's going to open up a lot of the field for those other three guys.
Yep.
And the other thing that I think that's a positive for this is now in the draft, you and I talked about.
Yes, I love where you're going with this. I love keep going.
You and I talked about this.
Yep.
There's a couple of wide receivers that may be available that are injured right now, but could potentially be really, really good NFL wide receivers.
Meaning Alabama's Jamison Williams, which would be a first-round candidate, and John Mechie from Alabama in the second round.
So now if you decide to take a shot on one of those guys, there's no rush.
Yep.
In forcing that, hey, we need you on the field right now. There's no rush in that. Now you can allow this guy to heal up. Yeah, you want him in the meeting rooms and you want him on the field if he's available, but you don't have to push that, because you don't want him coming back too soon and then re-injuring something. So you can take a shot on one of those guys, and now, you have that guy packed away for maybe late season, October, November, December, whatever, or next year, and it's not going to hurt you. So I think it's a positive all across the board. I think Parker is going to really help the offense. I think him and Mac Jones are going to get along really well. And you talked about 2019. Well, I think a big reason why that was his best year is because he was playing with Ryan Fitzpatrick.
Right.
And, like after Fitzpatrick left, he was playing with Tua, and that style of offense didn't really fit him.
No, you're absolutely right. And he's a little bit different from what they have. Obviously Hunter Henry as a tight end is more of like a possession receiver in a way too, right? But DeVante Parker gives you a guy who can play outside the numbers, can high point the ball, be a threat in the red zone. He can do a lot of different things there from that standpoint. They like to move Kendrick Bourne around a lot. He was really there. He really kind of turned into the Patriots' number one receiver throughout the season, right? And he really started developing a great relationship with Mac Jones. And by the way, the two of them with a couple other players are down in Tampa right now training, which was going around Instagram earlier. But, for me, you still have Jacoby Myers too. But as much as I love Jacoby Myers athletically, you should want more than that. And there's room for Myers on the roster, don't get me wrong. But I just think you need to stack the guys above him and keep Myers in like that fourth role. And to your point about the draft, Steve, I look at it and say, it takes a little pressure off the Patriots from needing to make a move in the first or second round. Now, I still want a receiver in the first or second round of the draft because I think that I want a guy on a 4 or potentially 5-year deal, if it's a first-round pick, to grow and develop with Mac Jones. And if you look at DeVante Parker and I'm sorry, I'm going to blank out now. We got Kendrick Bourne and DeVante Parker, I believe, are on 2-year deals. And then you have Myers and Aguilar on a 1-year deal. So you have some guys around for the next year or two, but you need to be thinking forward too, right? Which could go to your point about taking a guy who maybe he's fallen a little bit from an injury. Or if you draft someone, let's say it's like, a Khalil Shakur from, like Boise in like the 3rd round. You can put him in a role, but not, have to force him up the depth chart super early. You can kind of bring him along and think for a year ahead or so. I don't know. I'd like them to, again, I still want them to draft a receiver high, but the more I think about it, I still believe they'd go defense, best player available in the first round. Wouldn't rule out offensive tackle, although I'm expecting a run at this position before Patriots pick at 21, and then they can circle back for that receiver in round 2. And I think there's going to be a lot of really good options. Any final thoughts on this DeVante Parker conversation, Steve?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing to remember about him is that his career average is 14 yards a catch.
Right.
So, I mean, I think this is a really good move for the Patriots. I know he's had some injury issues, but I know. I think he's going to be motivated to come here and produce with Mac Jones. I think he sees it as an opportunity to make himself some money, and I think he's going to be motivated. And I really think he's going to open up a lot of real estate for those other guys. So I'm looking at this as a big positive for New England.
Right. And let me ask you this too. There was some rumors going around that the Patriots, and it's been rumored for a long time, the Patriots have had interest in a guy like Odell Beckham Jr. And it's been reported back for, months now, going back to last year. And then about a week ago, I'd say, someone, I forget who it was, and I apologize for not, crediting the right person, but had mentioned how the Patriots and him have talked, and they're just kind of monitoring that situation. Do you, again, you have to keep in mind he just got hurt at the end of the last season. So this is someone who wouldn't be able to come in late anyway. Do you think this Parker move would kind of X out the chance that Odell could come in later? And is that even someone that you'd be remotely interested in?
That's a good question. I kind of think they're leaving that option open. I know that they've always liked him. The Patriots have always been interested in him. I think if the price was right, and probably that's what they're doing, they're just going to let the market play out, see how the draft comes out, and post-draft, both sides can make an informed decision on which way they want to go with it. But I'd be a little surprised if they got OBJ at this point, but I wouldn't be shocked at the same time.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm torn. Obviously, he hasn't been bowled over by an offer because I think he'd be with the team by now. But I'm sure he's been offered several 1-year deals or 2-year deals, and I think it kind of has to be a 2-year deal given where he'd be potentially even be able to join the team. I know that Odell can move around a little bit more, and actually I thought he was a little impressive towards the end of last season. I still thought he had some of his legs back, but I don't know. I put that as kind of TBD. I don't think it's as much of a possibility now after the Parker move because I just don't know if they really want to spend the money, and I don't think he's going to come here for nothing. If he is, he's going to go to a team that has a better chance of winning a Super Bowl, in my opinion. But again, I still like where the Patriots are as of right now on offense. At least as far as passing weapons go, I still think that they are lacking, though, Steve, that dynamic playmaker with a little bit more juice. And if they could find that element into this offense, I think now you will have something cooking. And people always love to forget the conversation. When people talk about the Patriots offense, they always talk about it, and the conversation is always about how Mac Jones, is going to be the same level he was at his rookie year. And I think that's just flawed logic. Now, I don't know how much better he's going to get, but I promise he's going to be better next year than he is this year. Maybe he'll stumble a little bit out of the gate. Yeah, he did hit a little bit of a wall towards the end of last season, but he was, the best rookie quarterback last year by a pretty wide margin, in my opinion. And I still think he has a lot of room to grow. The biggest concern will be, how does the transition happen with the coaches? And I still think this offense is going to be better than it was last year, but it still is missing that elite piece to really put them in the next tier up where so many offenses in the AFC are right now.
Right. And, I was talking with Phil Perry earlier today
the senator
on another podcast. And, Phil brought up a really good point. And he said, because of their lack of speed, the Patriots' 2 running backs, Ramondre Stevenson and Damian Harris, both faced more 8th man in the box, than any other team was facing last year because teams weren't fearing the Patriots deep. Well, Parker takes a little bit of that edge off because now, are they going to want to bring that 8th guy in the box and leave a corner on an island with him? Maybe not. But, at least now they have to respect that a little bit. And the other thing was, like Phil was saying, because of that 8th guy in the box, Mac Jones faced more blitzes than any other quarterback.
Yeah, and they opposing defenses just loaded up front and forced everything short. And they wanted the Patriots to throw deep. They were daring them to throw deep because they're not going to give up, they didn't want to give up these 5, 10, 15, 20-yard passes. They want to make sure everything's in front of them, blitz Mac, make sure the run lanes are all covered. And yeah, if Jacoby Myers or Kendrick Bourne or Nelson Aguilar beat us deep, then we'll take our chances. And I do think Parker helps alleviate some of that pressure, to your point. But I still believe that piece that's missing is that the one that's going to keep opposing defensive coordinators up at night, before the game. That's just my opinion. All right, let's step aside here real quick, just take a quick break. And then after this, we are going to get into our Patriots prospect breakdown for defensive linemen in this year's class. All right, Steve, we are back, and we are getting into our second round of prospect breakdowns. We did our first one last week with wide receivers and some offensive linemen. This week, we're starting with the front seven. We're going to get to the secondary on Friday's show. So we broke it down into 3 categories. We got defensive linemen, edge players, and linebackers. So I figure we start with the big boys up front, Steve, okay? And I there's a lot of different directions that we could go in this. First off, what are your thoughts about the defensive lineman need from a Patriot standpoint in this draft? And let me add a second part to this. Last week, we talked about how the addition of Jabril Peppers, to the Patriots, and how the Patriots have a lot of guys at the safety position, and they could be going to more like nickel and dime looks. Now, they already played a lot of nickel because nickel's kind of the new base in the NFL. But for dime packages where you have 6 defensive backs on the field, we talked about, well, we could use a lot of safeties. One thing I kind of put to the side that I wanted to bring up on this episode specifically, and that relates to the defensive lineman coming out. If you're going to play with a lot of defensive backs, like I wonder if the Patriots could be doing, I feel like you have to get bigger up front on the defensive line. You have to have a lot of guys with some beef up front because the Patriots already struggled against the run last year. They were gashed at times. They were too light. And I think some of it was gap discipline. I think some of it was setting the edge issues. But I think drafting a defensive lineman early that can step in and play right away. I'm not saying you'll have the same impact as a Christian Barmore because that's setting the bar pretty high. But if you can draft a guy early who can eat up some blocks, really kind of maintain gap, integrity, and help control the ground, it gives the Patriots more flexibility on the back end to play with more defensive backs. What are your thoughts on that?
I absolutely agree with that. I mean, I thought the defensive line was very inconsistent last year. I thought Lawrence Guy didn't have a very good year.
Yeah.
He's usually very consistent.
Yep.
I like Davon Godchaux. I just think that he wasn't suited for playing over the nose. I think he's more like of a 1 or 3 technique, but I really think they need another big body in there, especially, as you said, if they're going to be lighter, playing more safeties. Some of the linebackers that they now have on the roster are not the typical big thumpers that the Patriots tend to draft. And we'll get into that, I'm sure, in just a couple of moments. But, with the lighter packages in there, you need those big guys up front to eat up some space and to make some penetration to allow those lighter packages to get home and make some tackles.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're on the same page from that standpoint. So let's get into these defensive linemen here, because there's a lot of different options you can go. But let's start with, we're going to keep the same, format or template as we did last week. Okay, we're going to talk about guys in the first round, kind of that second and third range, and then after that. So we'll break it down into 3 tiers. All right. So tier 1, Steve, for me personally, I'll start with this one. Okay. I got Jordan Davis and Devontae Wyatt, both from Georgia. I would put those 2 as the only options for me at Patriots if they stay at 21. Okay. Before you give me your thoughts on those 2 players, is there anybody else that you would put in that conversation?
No, and I'm glad you brought up those 2 guys, because it's like, I'm looking at my notes here, and it's filled with guys from Georgia and Alabama.
You'll see a theme here, and as we go through these positions.
But yeah, I think, if you're the Patriots, and a guy like Davis or Wyatt is there at 21, I think those guys are difference makers.
Yep.
And they're not going to be that sexy pick in the first round, but those are guys that are going to be there for like a decade. And, again, talking with Phil this morning, and he was like, hey, just like Vince Wilfork fell into the Patriots' lap, back in whatever it was, 2004, I think it was. If a guy like Davis somehow falls to 21, I think the Patriots have to jump on that, because I think you pair him next to Barmore and you have two dominant guys up front that can wreak havoc on opposing offenses. And those will be two guys that I think teams have to game plan for.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, Jordan Davis is an absolute mammoth. I mean, and he's just such a large human being and so athletic for his size. He's the kind of player that I can just imagine Bill would have so much fun with him and Barmore on that same defensive line. And they would just wreak havoc. And Davis is a special guy. It's hard for me to imagine he's going to fall to 21. I don't think it's out of the question, though, Steve, is because when you talk about Jordan Davis, I think one of the biggest concerns is his weight. And if his weight's too high, he becomes more of a rotational guy who can only play 25, 30 snaps a game. And someone like Wyatt, he's a little bit of a different player, right? But I think that some people look at Wyatt and say he can be disruptive. He can find the ball carrier really good when he's two gapping, which Bill wants to do. You could put him on more of like a more, I guess, towards like the tackle, and really have him be just a phenomenal defensive lineman, just a different type than Davis, and maybe he's on the field a little bit more. Do you have any concerns with Davis on his weight, snap, anything like that?
Not it's really. I mean, I watched him play last year, and I thought he was dominant. And then I watched him at the NFL Combine, and the guy is just a phenomenal athlete. And even if you decided, okay, yeah, you need to lose 10 more pounds, I think it'll only make him more athletic.
Right.
And he'd still be a load up front. I mean, I really don't have any concern. Maybe, as he ages, you'd probably want to trim him down a little bit.
I agree with that.
But right now, I wouldn't have any concerns with him whatsoever.
Yeah, and I think for him, he'd be the kind of player that would draw comparisons to a Vince Wilfork, I think, for a lot of reasons. I know that I saw on NFL.com, I believe Lance Zierlein compared him to like a Haloti Ngata, which is a hell of a comparison. And I think that those kinds of guys they're just true difference makers. I mean, for me, either one of those guys in the first round, I think you're going to get a good football player, a really good football player. I think that Wyatt is a little bit more realistic for the Patriots at 21. Now, when you go into round 2, Steve, for me, someone who I thought is kind of close to the round 1 range, which is Travis Jones from UConn. And then I really like Perion Winfrey from Oklahoma. That second round range, is there anyone on you besides those two guys that you would put in that category?
Yeah, Travis Jones. I mean, for all the talk that we were doing about, Davis at the Combine,
right?
If it wasn't for Davis, I think we'd all be talking the same thing about Travis Jones.
Oh, he blew it up.
Yeah,
he blew it up. And actually, I was on your other show. I was on your other show with Claire and Murph, and Murph was asking about Travis Jones early because I know he kind of that's his neck of the woods anyway. Yeah. But like he was asking about Travis Jones, and I think when I was on the show, if I'm not mistaken, I think I said I thought he would go around pick 50. Well, then he goes to Indy and then blows it up. And now people are having him in that fringe first round conversation. I think Travis Jones, to me, Steve, would be someone who, if the Patriots trade back into like the early second round or the very end of the first round, I could see Travis Jones being on their radar at that position, but not at 21. What about you?
Yeah, I don't think he's first round pick. I mean, if you wanted to take him in the second, I don't think I'd have any issue with that. Yeah, he just blew it up at the Senior Bowl as well. So, I think he's definitely increase his draft stock. The other guy I like in the second round, Alabama guy, Phidarian Mathis.
Yep, I was going to get to him in like third round range, but go ahead.
Yeah,
talk about Mathis.
He's one of those big Alabama guys, 3-year starter. He just eats up some space. He's very athletic for a big guy. I think if you keep your 54th pick and a guy like him is there and you take somebody else in the first round, I think that would be a really nice move. I think that if you're taking him in round 2, I think that's a good move. Him or Jones, I think, are my second round, draft picks for defensive linemen.
Yeah, and you know what? I think with Mathis, before we get back to Jones, I think with Mathis, you'd be getting someone that is such a prototypical, like Nick Saban, Bill Belichick, defensive lineman that can really just be a run stopper, and you can move him kind of all over the defensive line, and I think that will be something that intrigues, Bill at the next level for Mathis. You can go back to Jones, who will go earlier. Travis Jones from UConn. I look at him as more of a true nose, so he's really more in the middle, which would be fine because you could still put him in the middle, throw Christian Barmore on maybe like the left defensive end spot, and then try to find another guy or a veteran like Gottschall or someone to play on the right side, Lawrence Guy, somebody like that. So that would be interesting. And Perrion Winfrey from Oklahoma is another player that I really liked. I like him a little bit more than Mathis because I just think that he can be a little bit more active. And I think that Mathis, to me, I would feel better about him in the third round just because of the style of player that he is. But I don't think that it would be a reach in the second round at all. I know that CLNS media member Evan Lazar put out a mock draft. I want to say it was today, which is we're recording April 5th at 4 p.m. right now. So I think he had Mathis in the second or third round right there. So I think that's a totally fair range, and definitely a player that would be interesting. But for me, I just think that he's just such an impressive body type, really, really frequently around the ball, really strong. I think his upside is somewhat a little bit higher than Mathis, which is why I have him ranked where he is. What about for anybody in the late round, Steve?
And I know I'm going to butcher his name.
If you said the same name as me, I'm going to crack up right now.
Ioma?
Yep.
Uwazurike?
Yeah, you butchered that one. I'm going to butcher too, but it's Ioma Uwazurike. All right, from Iowa State. That's it. And he is on my list. I don't know how I can share. I'm not sure how I can share my screen. We're going to do this live. Okay. So let's see how bad this is going to be. I'm scared. I'm scared to do this right now. But if I show my, I can't because my system preferences, but on my draft notes, Steve, I, under my 5th to 7th round range, which is where I kind of put my tier 3 guys for those at home, I have Uwazurike from Iowa State right there, first with a bullet. Really intriguing player. Tell me what you like about him.
He has intriguing size. I mean, he's 6'6". I think he's like 320. He had 12 tackles for losses, 9 sacks. He's a kind of a different type of player than you'd normally see at that position. His going by his size because of his length, but I think I'm not talking an early round, but if he's there in the 5th, 6th round, I think that's a great move for the team to do.
Yeah, I agree. And I would say that for him, it's size, length, athleticism. I mean, he brings a lot to the table. And I like what you said. He weighed in at the combine. I think they had him just under 320. I think he was like 315-ish. But he's a little tall, which I know some people get worried about. But I just think his athletic profile and his frame, so intriguing. And it's someone that I could see having fun molding him. Wouldn't be a guy that you're expecting to start year 1, right? But this is someone who maybe, year 2 down the road, getting some coaching, I feel like he could be a diamond in the rough, Steve, so we're on the same page. Anybody else for defensive lineman that you have listed or want to make an honorable mention of?
A small school guy.
Okay.
Taylor Humphrey from Louisiana.
Yep.
Huge nose tackle type, a Vince Wilfork type.
Yeah, there's a couple of guys on Louisiana's offensive and defensive line that are intriguing, but continue.
Yeah, I mean, he's strictly a run stuffer. He's not a, he's not going to be a big pass rush kind of guy. But, again, if you're talking late rounds, if he's available, we talked about some of their issues at stopping the run. I think he'd be a really nice pickup, and he's a guy that would probably get some play.
Yep, absolutely. And so that's a good name for people to kind of earmark, right? Let's move on though to let's go edge here. All right, second round, I guess second positional group as we move around the front seven. We started with defensive linemen. Follow the same format, Steve, and I'm going to let you go first on this one. So, edge players, give me your breakdown.
Yeah, I mean, we all know Hutchinson and Thibodeau, guys like that. They're not going to be there.
Yes,
at 21. So, I mean, I'm not even including them in any kind of thought process here. I mean, it'd just be, wishful thinking for any of those guys to be there. I think a lot of edge guys will be coming off the board really early in the draft this year. So I was looking at somebody that fits the Patriots profile and has a chance of being there. And, again, talking with Phil Perry today, I asked Phil, because I had this guy's name in mind, and I said, who do you see as a realistic option of being there at 21? And he was like, the guy I would love to see at 21 is Jermaine Johnson out of FSU.
Yep.
And
some people have him going as high as 4 now.
I mean, and like talking with Phil, he's like, his draft projections are all over the place. I mean, some people have him top 5, top 10. Other people have him bottom of the first round. Some people even have him as a second rounder. So he's like, there's no way of telling until we see the board play out. But again, I really like this guy. He was a Georgia guy. He went into the transfer portal so he could get more playing time. And the question about him was, well, now that he's away from all those big names on that Georgia defense, how's he going to, how is he going to play? And he ended up being the ACC Defensive Player of the Year.
Right.
He's 6'5", 255. He's got 34-inch arms. The Patriots like that. 12 sacks, 18 tackles for loss, 2 pass breakups, and 2 forced fumbles. He's got a relentless motor. And the thing about him is I think he hasn't even hit his peak yet. I think he's still, climbing that ladder. I think he's still ascending. I think we haven't seen the best of him yet. I think he's going to be a better pro than he was a college player.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just going to say it right now. I think that Jermaine Johnson is going to be better than Kayvon Thibodeau. Okay, if it was just for me, I just not a big Thibodeau fan. I think Johnson's going to go in the top 10, unfortunately, Steve. But that would be a dream scenario. And honestly, if he falls that far, part of me would think that it's because there has to be something maybe medical related that we don't know or something along those lines. But hey, like you and Phil's conversation earlier, never say never. And I'll mention a player that unfortunately got hurt in this pre-draft process, but that is David Ojabo from Michigan. And he's at his pro day, he tears his Achilles, just a terrible, terrible situation. Really unfortunate for him, but he's a really good player, and the Patriots have had interest in the Michigan defensive, pool over the last couple of years. Now there was that Don Brown connection as their DC. He's now with the University of Arizona, so he's moved on from the program. But I still think that they like some of those players that have come through the Michigan defensive program. And Ojabo's a really interesting player. I mean, I think he's one of, you talk about ascending players like Jermaine Johnson. I think Ojabo is just kind of scratching what he can be. And he's someone with the right coaching can turn into a full-time player. Right now, obviously he has to get healthy first, obviously. But I think you could have him in terms of an edge rusher right away and develop him more into someone later. He would be an intriguing guy for me. It's just tough because it's like you probably have to take him in the first round. It would be a little unfortunate for me, Steve. And this is going to sound really like kind of harsh, and I don't really mean it to be, but getting a player like that is going to be missing at least half the season, if not more. Yeah, I just feel like there's going to be better players with similar players that are graded at the same level as Ojabo that can make an impact right away. And I think the team needs to probably go that way. Now, if he's just so much highly rated than everybody else on the board, then you make an exception for it. I just have a hard time that's going to be the case right there. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and it's, they did this 2 times last year. I mean,
yep.
2 players they took last year, they took with the knowledge that they weren't going to get anything out of them in their rookie season. So it's not above the Patriots to do that. If they feel like this is a guy that can be the player that, that they hope he can be. I felt bad for Ojabo. There was also the kid from LSU, Damon Clark, he injured himself as well. He'll probably, I think he had spinal surgery, I think, right? And he's going to probably miss his entire rookie season. But, if you really like that player, I'm not saying Clark so much, but Ojabo, the Patriots have shown that they're willing to do that. And, with the Achilles, you're probably looking at November at the earliest for him.
Yep.
So you pretty much write off his rookie season. But, you have to kind of balance it because they really need help on the edge. And they still don't really know what they have, with Josh Uche or Ronnie Perkins right now. So, I'm thinking in another year, that might be a move. But I think this year, if you're going to draft a guy, for edge help, I think you need him on the field this year.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And another player I would say in the first round conversation would be Boye Mafe. I definitely would include him in the conversation from Minnesota. Another guy, you're talking about a player where you're drafting him based on the fact that he's going to ascend, right? And Mafe has a lot of physical traits that I can see Bill really, really enjoying. But another player where he needs to focus more on some of his fundamental work and coaching. And this is someone who can have a role as a rookie, but grow as to a starter in year 2. Now, part of this, I kind of wonder, for him, what his best fit is from a scheme standpoint. And I think that's one of the harder things as we're talking about these guys in the front 7. I know Bill likes to be multiple, but is he thinking, they want to do more of a 3-down lineman and have more size? Or do they want, go with a 4-3, but just take some of the linebackers away and play with more, defensive backs? I don't know. I don't know what he wants to do. Part of me, if this draft, Steve, is relatively defensive heavy, which I would expect it to be, if it is, I feel like it could tell us what Bill's future plans for this defense truly are.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned Mafe, because I had him as a late first rounder, early second rounder.
Yep.
So
I put it in that range. I agree.
Yeah. I kind of had him. I was kind of wondering, where would he fit? And again, I guess it would depend on how they view him on their draft board.
But let's say the Patriots trade down with the Kansas City Chiefs. We've talked about that for weeks.
Yeah, like at 29. That would be
his range.
If you're 29, then I think a guy like him would have to definitely be on your radar.
I see. Again, it goes back to similar to what I feel about David Ojabo. And I know it's different circumstances because Ojabo is hurt, but to me, I like Boye Mafe. I just have a feeling there's going to be players that are more highly graded at 21. But if you do trade down to the late first or early second, I think that would be a better range probably for him. But the talent is there. I mean, there's no doubt. There's no arguing the talent level. It's really just about can he put everything together. As we move into the second, third round conversation, Steve, I really, really have enjoyed watching Nick Bonito from Oklahoma. I know Drake Jackson from USC should be in that conversation. He's been a really, really busy guy in terms of, I know he has like 13 visits scheduled with upcoming teams. I think there's a lot of interest in him. Who do you like in that second, third round range?
You got all my notes down like you were reading over my shoulder.
I wish I was reading over your shoulder, but no.
Yeah. Nick, I had down Mafe, Bonito, Drake Jackson. Another guy that's intriguing because of his size is the kid from Purdue, George Karlaftis. I think
George Karlaftis. Yep.
Yeah, Karlaftis. He's more of a bigger guy. He's like 6'4", 270, 275, and he's got the size, the power, he's pretty impressive. I don't know how the Patriots would look at him, but
I'll say this about I didn't mean to cut you off, but I'll say this about him and the Patriots connection. He has the size that they usually really like on the edge. That 6'4", 270 elephant roll thing. Like, I just don't know. I'm just not crazy about him, Steve. I'm going to be honest. Like, I would like him in the second round, and the first rounder, I don't know. I mean,
not as a first rounder.
I think he's going to go in the first round. That's the problem, and I'm just I don't know.
If they were to take him or Nick Bonito in the second round, or Drake Jackson, I wouldn't have a problem with any of that.
No, I wouldn't. And I really, really like Bonito. My thing with him is that I just wonder if he fits kind of the prototype of what they usually like, because he's a little bit more undersized. But someone like Karlaftis, who has a lot bigger of a frame, probably going to demand going much, much earlier. I just don't know. To me, I just feel like he's a little underwhelming as a first-round draft pick, I guess is how I should word that.
I agree with that.
Who else do you like, Steve? Anybody else on your list of notes there?
Well, I can't go a draft without mentioning a guy from South Carolina. So Kingsley and Agbare, mid to late round guy. Yep. I like him. He's got that speed to power. He's a bull rusher. He tends to try to overwhelm guys, but again, if you're looking at a mid to late round guy, I'd take a flyer on him.
Yeah. Isaiah Thomas, for me, someone that stuck out a little bit. I'd put him probably in that 5th, 6th range. Another Oklahoma player. I mean, again, we're talking about a lot of the same schools. Alabama, Georgia, Oklahoma. There's a lot of guys, in that front 7 range with some really, really intriguing profiles. So a couple names we threw out there for edge players. And now we get into the third section of our draft prospect breakdown for this week's show, which is the linebackers to round out the top 7. Now, linebackers has been an interesting conversation, Steve. I put it really, really high on my needs early on in the process. I remember we disagreed. One of the rare times that we disagreed, and you were kind of pushing some of the guys that they've drafted over the last couple of years and pushing them up. I don't think that that's a bad thought. I just wonder, it's one of those things we say all the time on the show. It's impossible for us to know because we don't see every practice. We're not in the film rooms. I don't know what Bill Belichick thinks about some of what their form, some of these younger guys they've drafted over the last couple of years in the front 7, what he really thinks about them. And I think that you get into a really interesting conversation at linebackers because there's so many different directions the Patriots could go here. In the first round, you're talking about Nakobe Dean from Georgia. You're talking about Devin Lloyd from Utah, amongst others. Okay, but those two guys, really interesting. Devin Lloyd is a little undersized from what Bill has typically gone for, but he's much bigger than someone like Nakobe Dean. But if you watched any of Georgia's games last year, you saw Nakobe Dean, and sometimes, Steve, I just look at it and just keep it simple. And we always say the KISS thing, keep it simple, stupid. And when you turn on a game, you turn on any kind of film or however you're digesting these players, you look at Nakobe Dean, you say, this guy can play football. And I think it goes back to, if you remember last year, Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah from Notre Dame. There was a lot of conversation about him and where he was going to go because everyone was worried about his tweener size. Well, he went to the second round by the Cleveland Browns and ended up having a really good year. I feel like good coaches can put players into certain positions for them to exceed. I think that Nakobe Dean checked so many boxes for Bill Belichick outside of his actual frame. Because someone like Kyle Duggar is bigger than Nakobe Dean, so it's a really interesting conversation. Do you care for either one of those players? And do you think the Patriots would actually pull the trigger on somebody like that?
I'm not sure about Dean. I've been, adamant about that through the whole thing, just because size-wise, he's not very big, but at the same time, you can't argue with his playmaking. So, we'll see how they feel about him. I do have a feeling he's going to go early. And the other guy I'm going to mention as a first rounder, the guy I kind of like, is Devin Lloyd, which, I mean, he is a little bit smaller than, but
he's smaller than Gerard Mayo was coming out of Tennessee. He's smaller than Dante Hightower was coming out of Alabama. But I could see him being that next guy for the Patriots defense, Steve, where he's, a leader, a captain, can come in and be the quarterback of the defense in the middle of the field. I can see Devin Lloyd bringing that guy. Obviously, his conference it doesn't stick out like Nakobe Dean's does, but it's still, he's still a very good player, good athletic profile. There's a lot to like about Devin Lloyd and what he could potentially do.
Yeah, highly productive.
Very.
And he was the Pac-12 Defensive Player of the Year. I mean, he's a 2-time Butkus Award finalist.
Yep.
So, I mean, he can play. I mean, 22 tackles for a loss in the Pac-12, 8 sacks, 4 interceptions, 2 he returned for touchdowns. A team captain, he started off, I believe, as a safety. He's very good in coverage. There's a lot to like about him. Again, if he's there at 21, if they want to make a pick, I would think that was a really safe, good pick, and I think he would immediately start for this team.
Yeah, I mean, I would be very intrigued with adding either one of those players in the first round. I just think with what they have on the roster, they can start right away and still have other guys around them to utilize in different ways. But you have someone kind of patrolling the middle that has a little bit more speed that position. And look, I mean, I know people don't want to talk about the Bills, game, the playoff game, but I mean, speed just stuck out like a sore thumb in that game,
Yes.
And both of those players, I think, could help address that need there. But again, I think there's a lot of guys, Steve, as you look into past the first round, you get into like the second, third, maybe even early fourth round. There's a lot of guys I like at linebacker for the Patriots here. I think for me, Steve, I have 3, potentially even like 4 in the conversation in the second round. I have Christian Harris from Alabama. I have Chad Muma from Wyoming. I have Quay Walker from Georgia. And Troy Anderson from Montana State is right in that third round, probably second round range too. Those 4 guys to me, I think, are all on the table.
It's funny because I have all those same names written down here. Christian Harris, I think, I think he's that, like you said earlier, that Nick Saban, that prototypical Saban, Belichick kind of guy.
Yep.
He's not the biggest guy. He's only 230, but, a 3-year starter. He's excellent in coverage for running backs and tight ends. But he's a physical run stuffer. He's very athletic. I think, he's a really good pick. You get into Chad Muma from Wyoming, I think is, really smart IQ, football IQ player. He calls all the defensive calls. He's kind of like that Belichick kind of linebacker. I like him. He's a really good finisher. He averaged 11 tackles a game for the past 2 years, so he's productive. I'm glad you mentioned, Troy Anderson from Montana State, because
really, he's kind of a guy really kind of climbing up the boards for a while.
Yeah, well, he was kind of my sleeper, early in the process. He's not anymore because now
he's awake.
Everyone's talking about him now, so it's like, okay, so he's going to go earlier than I had originally envisioned.
Yeah, and he played on both sides of the ball at times. Really versatile player. I think Bill could just love what his projection could be, kind of a Swiss Army knife, but he has good size. He's 6'3", about 245. I mean, that's 25 pounds bigger than someone like Nakobe Dean, who we mentioned earlier. And he's someone, again, who I think originally was kind of in like that 5th round range, that day 3 range. And now people are talking about him as like a relatively early day 2 pick even. And I have a feeling that someone like Troy Anderson, Steve, will be a 2nd rounder on a couple of teams' boards and like an early 4th on a couple others. Like, I think there'll be a varying degree with him than some of the other guys that we're talking about. But I really like him. I just think he's a fun player to project. But to circle back on one of the guys we mentioned earlier, Christian Harris from Alabama, this is another guy who, look, he's long, he's lean, he's athletic, but he's 225 pounds. So again, we get back to that. I feel like a broken record here. I don't want to, be that way, but it does seem like there's a lot of players in this draft that could bring an athletic profile that this team doesn't really have, but it would in turn cause Belichick to do something he doesn't traditionally do. So before, we keep going with some of these players, let me ask you this question. Do you think Bill will take one of these guys who are, let's say he's a linebacker, sub 240?
I think he will. Depending on how the board plays out, if one of these guys is available, I think that he will take him because these guys can play.
Yep.
And, they can play in a system that, very similar to what he uses. That's why, like Harris, played at Alabama. Alabama's defense is very similar to the Patriots. So,
no, I agree. I would mention a couple guys over there. Like, I think I mentioned Quay Walker already, Steve. If I didn't,
yep.
I really like Quay Walker. Really, really fascinating. Georgia front seven, just in general, just really, really, interesting. A bunch of different guys there. But he's instinctive, and I feel like he's ready to play. Now, you get Trayvon Walker and Jordan Davis and Devontae Wyatt, and guys we've already mentioned. Those guys are better players, but I think Quay Walker and another guy I'll mention in a second are kind of forgotten in the mix. And I think if the Patriots were to say, if they were to go linebacker, if they were to go like cornerback in round 1, if they think that linebacker is a need, I think they could draft Quay Walker in the 2nd round and get a potential starter from almost day 1.
Yeah, my only question is, would he be there at 54? I'm not so sure.
I don't know if he would be. I don't think he would be. But I mean, what if there's been a lot of these scenarios. Patriots trade back a couple from 21, and then they move up a little bit from 54. I think that's in play. I certainly do. I think, Steve, honestly, that if they do move back at 21, that you're going to see them move up and down this board. I'm going to say no less than, I would say 2 is the bare minimum, but I think you're going to see them make 3 or 4 moves. I think they're going to be active this draft because they're going to want to target certain players at certain spots, and you're right, Quay Walker's probably not going to be there at 54, but what if you moved up to the mid 40s? I think he'd be in the conversation there.
Yeah. And we'd be remiss unless we mention a prototypical Patriot linebacker in the middle rounds.
Are you talking about Leo Chenal?
Yeah. And we all talk about there aren't any more linebackers the size of Donta Hightower and Jawan Bentley. Yes, there is.
Enter the Wisconsin Badger, Leo Chenal.
Yeah, and you talk about a thumper. Now, again, he's got decent straight line speed. It's 4.5. That's not bad, but he doesn't have the agility to cover. But prototypical run thumper, 6'3", 250, comes downhill, blows stuff up. He's built like an anvil. And he can destroy the running game. But again, in today's NFL, where so much is predicated on speed in the passing game, I don't know that he's the answer for them. Again, if you're looking mid, 4th, 5th round, and a guy like that's available, yeah, you could find a spot for him, obviously, in certain situations, but he's not really what you need at this point.
No, he's a really interesting player. I could see Bill really liking him, but I would also say he's kind of what they already have. And I mean, Juwan Bentley and him, they're both like those middle of the field kind of players. And like you said about Chenal, he's jacked up. I think he can play. You could plug him and play him, I honestly think, pretty early on in his career. But if you're not going to pair him with some more athletic speed around him, I think you'll see him be exposed a little bit. But that is the kind of player that Bill, I would think, salivates over. You know,
he made a 40.5-inch vertical.
Yeah.
I mean, that's pretty damn good for a 250-pound.
About 40 inches taller than I could jump these days. You know, I'm only about a half an inch off the ground. That's it.
Yeah.
You know, that's it. Any late round prospects that you like as linebackers, Steve?
Well, the guy I mentioned earlier, Damon Clark, I mean, he had spinal surgery. So, again, he's probably going to miss all of this year. I think a lot of people had him going early, you know, day 2 type of thing. I think now he's going to be a 6th or 7th rounder. If a guy like that's available, then, you know, you maybe take a flyer on him and hope that he recovers completely and he's available for you next year. Another guy that I wrote about for mid to late rounds, and he's more of that Patriot type of linebacker, Darian Beavers.
Yep, Darian Beavers. I'm glad you mentioned Beavers. I would put him in the same conversation as Chenal. You can get him 3rd, 4th round. I could definitely see the Patriots being interested. I'm just not sure that's the type of guy that should be going after. But yeah, speak to Beavers though, because I do think he's a good player in that Cincinnati defense.
Yeah, and again, I mean, you know, he's kind of a bigger guy. I mean, he's not, you know, he's 6'4", like 255, you know, and again, he's very aggressive. He's got a good football IQ. He definitely brings some heat when in the running game, but you know, he can rush the passer a little bit, but you know, he's not the greatest coverage guy. So, and I think he would be exposed a little bit too. But the thing about him, you know, he was a 4-team special teams player and a leadership guy. So, you know, middle rounds, I could see Bill taking him.
Yeah, the last guy I'll mention too is probably, you know, in that I would say 6th-ish round range would be Jeremiah Moon from Florida. This is someone who was moved. He wasn't always an off-the-ball linebacker. He was up against the edge, and he really, really struggled. And, you know, if you talk to certain people or read certain reports on him, he wouldn't have been drafted if he had stayed on the edge. They moved him back to linebacker. He's 6'5", 250, long, athletic, and really, really found a better home at linebacker. And a lot of people look at his size and they saw his tape of just 1 year transitioning backwards. And all of a sudden you're going to see, I think a lot of coaches go, this guy has untapped potential. And so, again, someone at his size that looks like he does, it just cut up, really just, you know, you don't see guys who are 6'5", 250 look like he does with long arms. I think his move to off-ball linebacker showed that he's a better athlete than what people thought he was going to be. And he could be in that range, like I said, day 3 pick, someone where you're looking at your later picks in the draft and say, I want to have a chance to coach this kid up because I think that there's more to his game.
It's a good pick. That's somebody I hadn't considered. So that's it's good that we went in that direction.
Yeah, you know, and honestly, with some of these like later round prospects, as we're going through, you know, obviously we've been looking at guys for a long time, but you always start up towards the top and you work your way down. And you know, as I'm getting into some of these positions I deem needs for the Patriots, and you get into some of these later picks, you know, players like Moon pop up, and I just think that he's a name that I just think that people should put in the back of their minds, because some of these guys that, yeah, you're not going to start right away, but you have some untapped potential. I think Bill loves those guys. You know, and everybody at the Florida program raves about him. And so when you have a good character kid with an athletic body, with that kind of frame, and you have success at a new position, even if it's only 1 year, I think Bill looks at that and says, let's see what I can do with them in the building. Steve, okay, we are done with our front 7 breakdown for today. We are going to do secondary on Friday. So we got corners, safeties to break down. That's going to be a really fun conversation. Also, for those listening, either live or on podcast later, we want to do some more draft Q&A stuff. So send us over your questions on Twitter. And hit us up with those, and we can definitely answer some questions there. But also, I just wanted to mention, as Kevin O'Malley writes, in time for some defensive backs. Yeah, we are going to get to that in just a couple of days, man. So I am right there with you, Steve. As we wrap up today, any final thoughts on our front seven breakdown or on the DeVante Parker acquisition by the Patriots that we kicked off the show with?
Well, I think the front seven guys, that's my favorite positions to watch. And there's so many intriguing choices here. I think they have a lot of really good guys that they can, pick throughout this draft. I think they can find good players through the 5th, 6th round that can play a role for the team. So it's going to be interesting to see how their board plays out and how the big board plays out as well. But they have some big decisions to make.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of guys on this class that we just discussed, from defensive linemen, edge players to linebackers, and I definitely think there's a need there. It's also, like we mentioned, it depends on what Bill thinks of some of the players that have come into the Patriots the last couple of years, and I think that oftentimes, we say, you got to look at what his actions are, not really what he says, and I think how the draft plays out. There's no control over that from his standpoint, but the players and the types of players that he picks could indicate specifically on defense what direction they're going to go. And I am anticipating a defensive lineman pretty high because I just think they want to add to that group. When you got Lawrence Guy getting older, Devon Godchaux, they gave a ton of money to, who was really pretty underwhelming last year. I think when these guys get off the books, they're going to want some young, affordable talent on that front seven. So I think defensive line is definitely in play early in this draft. But just want to wrap up for today's show. Again, we are going to record again on Friday, so be sure to join us there. We'll tweet out some news about the show. Again, I'm Derek Havens, Steve Balsherry. We are both PatsFans.com bloggers. Be sure to subscribe to us on YouTube, on Apple Podcasts, Spreaker, wherever you download your podcasts. Be sure to like us, leave us a review. It keeps us high in the rankings so other Patriots fans can find us. And we'll see you guys next week. Or I should say later this week.